Hey there, I'm Tommy, and today I'm gonna walk you through mixing drums that feel loud, punchy and full regardless of the quality of your recordings or sample sounds. Because if you're working with live drums, there's a lot that goes into getting good drum sounds, such as the drummer, mics, room acoustics, etc, etc. But you'll not always be working under perfect conditions, so you need to know how to approach drum processing in a way that's effective and professional. And even if you're using samples or working with VSTs, by trying these steps I'm about to show you here, you'll be able to go from amateur to a professional sound in just a few minutes. There's a few stuff to cover, so let's dive in. Let me start by telling you about the project and the section we'll be working on for this video. This song was actually recorded in a professional environment by Telefunken, and most of the tracks actually came out sounding pretty good right from the start. There's just one major issue on the snare, which we'll need to fix if we want our drums to sound full and punchy. But before we get started on the processing, let me show you what that sounds like with all the effects on, just so you can see what I landed. I really like how it sounds. The drums have energy, they're bright, and we didn't lose any of the live energy of the recordings, which is great. There's also enough space for the guitars and the vocals to really cut through the mix, so that worked out pretty well. And let's see how I got to these sounds. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is that I'm doing a combination of channel-based processing on each of the mics on the kit, and then I'm also using some buses. So all of my drum tracks are getting routed to the drum bus master channel, and then I also have the overheads on an individual bus, just so I can process them simultaneously. We'll get to the drum bus processing later, but let's cover the channel-based processing first. And the first thing I want to cover is parallel compression. Now, I don't understand why some people only do this at the end of their chain, but because parallel compression needs transients to work with, it's actually better earlier in the chain, before you apply lots of gain reduction to it. So here on the hi-hats, I noticed that it was very quiet at certain sections. And I just wanted the overall level to stay consistent over the song. So I have the 1176 on the channel, which also adds some gritty character to it, with a fast attack and medium to slow release. So it really kills those transients. Then using the mix knob, we end up with a blend of the original signal mixed with the compressed signal, which doesn't have the transient information. And this results in a fuller and more dense sound, because we're essentially just bringing the quieter volumes a bit up in volume while maintaining the transient information. So let's go ahead and give that a listen, just so you can hear what this one compressor is doing to the signal. I'm gonna play you bypassed first and then enable the effect, and notice how it brings some fullness to the sound. So it does make a big change, and because we're using a fat compressor, it also adds some harmonics to it, which makes the signal brighter as well. But bringing the quiet sounds up is really not enough to get to those punchy and loud drum sounds that we want. So we also need some downwards compression as well, which is just the usual compression as you know it, working on the peaks. For this, I'm using at least one 1176 on each track. But then I also have another compressor on the kick, snare and toms, because they're the most dynamic elements on the session. So I'm going for a fast attack and a medium to fast release, just so I get some punch first. And the reason why I'm not using a slower compressor is because my drums are actually pretty transient already, so there's no need for a slower attack time at this point. So here's how the entire kit sounds like after compression. I'm gonna play you bypassed first again, and then activate the plugins. You see this world that we're living in. Okay, so next up, I want to show you the biggest problem with these recordings. This was already clear for me at the beginning of the project, but it's become impossible to ignore after dialing in some compression. So let me solo the snare top and you'll understand what I mean. That's just a lot of resonance. And I did have two equalizers before compression, but it still sounds really, really bad after it. So I realized that one of the best options to handle this type of work would be things like SU2, but because not everyone has access to it, I just decided to use a bunch of equalizers for this video. And the goal here is really to just carve out those frequencies. So there's a nasty ringing at around 600 Hz, which I try to attenuate using the first two equalizers, but then after the compression, because it was still there, I decided to use a few narrower bands to get rid of some of the resonance. And this is not something I usually do. I personally feel that's just a waste of time, but on this particular application, I decided to use a few narrower bands so I don't mess too much with how the snare sounds. And again, on this second equalizer, I'm just making sure I duck some of those nasty frequencies, and then I'm also adding some body because the snare was getting kinda thin. This was just my attempt to make up for it. So let me play you with and without the EQs so you can hear the difference. So it's not great, it's still there, but it's good enough and we still get the hit from the snare. Also, because I do have the snare coming from other mics, such as the snare bot, the drum room, the overheads, and it's also bleeding from other mics. Once we play it all together, it actually sounds pretty good and you can tell the resonance is there. So moving on, let's talk about saturation. If you look at most of my drum tracks signal chain, you'll notice that I do have a Saturn II unit applied in most of them. And I'm not doing a lot with it, but it does help bringing the signal forward and adding some nice punch to the kit. So the signal gets fuller, it gets brighter, and it also helps making the lower frequencies easier to hear and translate better across different devices. So if you look at my drum room signal, for example, you'll notice that I'm actually boosting the low frequencies quite a lot. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I felt like my kick just wasn't cutting through the mix. So I'm bringing it up here a little bit just to help compensate for that. So let's solo our drum room and then turn it on and off again, just so you can hear the difference. So now that we've talked about the channel-based processing, let's get into the drum bus processing in Reverb as well. And let me walk you through my drum bus processing first. So again, it starts with some parallel compression to make the entire kit fuller and to also glue it together. Then I've got another Saturn II unit, and here I've split the frequency spectrum in two bands, so I can work on the lower and higher frequencies individually. Here I'm just trying to bring the subsonics a bit forward while also getting a brighter sound on the kit. Next in my chain is some compression, and again the 1176 with a fast attack and medium to fast release, just so I can work on the peaks. Then there's another compressor, and this time the Fruity Limiter from FL Studio, and I've got a slower attack, a slower release, also a lower ratio to gently glue everything together. Finally, I'm using the Pultec equalizer so I can get the Pultec punch, and I'm also sharpening those frequencies at around 12K with a small boost. So what this equalizer is essentially doing is just working on the edges of the frequency spectrum of my kit. So I'm tightening the lows and I'm also boosting the highs a little bit. Let's go ahead and do an A-B comparison to understand what the drum bus chain is doing to the signal. So let's have a listen. Before we can call this a finished product, there's just one final thing we need to do to get our drum sounds even fuller, which is dialing in some ambience. On this project, I do have some ambience coming from the drum room and overheads already. But if you're not working with live sounds and are using samples or a VST instead, you'll likely have a super dry signal at this point. Even more because there's lots of compression and saturation happening as well, so we need to create some depth and ambience on these sounds so that they can work well with the song and not just be super dry and right at your face. So besides having some natural ambience coming from the mics, I do have a reverb as well. Again, this is very subtle, but it helps gluing the sounds together. I'm using the Valhalla Supermassive for this, which is a free reverb, but I really love how it sounds. And I actually have one pro tip for you here, and that is to apply an equalizer before the reverb and saturation after it. On the equalizer, I usually like to apply a high-pass filter and sometimes a low-pass filter as well. On this case, I'm using just a high-pass filter at around 120 Hz. And then after the reverb, I'm using the Saturn II to add some nice, gritty character to it, which just makes the reverb sound a bit brighter and more interesting. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to mute the Saturn II and turn off the reverb so we'll hear the drums dry, just the ambience from all the mics. And then I'm gonna turn on the reverb alone so we also hear the wet signal, and then add the saturation after it to get to the end product. So let's play this first and then I'll play it all together. So you might have noticed it does get a bit fuller and we create some depth on the drum kit, which sounds very nice. So this is how it sounds all together. So as we've learned in this video, every processing plays its own role in taking our dry drums and making them big, full and punchy. Hopefully I've given you some things to try in your mixes, and let me know down in the comments if I've missed anything that should have been in this video. As always, if you found this video helpful, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to stay up to date with our new plugins and content. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching and I'll see you on the next one.